Chapter 8. The Murder of Sarah Lynn Lewinski. The murder cases that grab the most headlines tend to be ones where the victims are truly innocent and in the wrong place in the wrong time. Part of the shock in those types of cases comes from the sense that no matter how safe a neighborhood one may live in, there is always the potential to be the victim of a heinous crime. Indeed, it is relatively rare, even in cities with high crime rates, for people not involved in criminal activity to be murdered. When people do hear about criminals and people from the lowest rungs of society being murdered, the response is often differential at best. The philosophy holds that the police are here to protect law-abiding citizens, not the criminals and other assorted scum. But the reality is that the police are here to protect all members of society, no matter what a person's situation currently is. No one is disposable and every life has value, even the lives of criminals and prostitutes. The best police officers around the world hold this attitude, which was put into action by the St. Petersburg, Florida, Police Department when they discovered the body of 49-year-old prostitute Sarah Lynn Lewinski. Around 11 p.m. on May 21, 2005, residents who were staying at the St. Petersburg Ronald McDonald House were awoken up by sounds of screams. Oftentimes in large American cities such sounds go unnoticed, but possibly because of the proximity of the Ronald McDonald House, a resident called the police. The police responded to the scene, but after they saw no signs of an assault or other criminal activity they moved on to other calls. The next day, the body of Sarah Lynn Lewinski was discovered under a deck of the Ronald McDonald House. She had been raped and strangled to death, but other than the ear witness who called into the police the night of the murder, there were no witnesses to the crime. Police immediately suspected that Lewinski, who was homeless and had been working as a prostitute, fell victim to a serial rapist who had been operating in the area. A background check of Lewinski revealed that she was new to the Tampa Bay and knew few people, so it was believed that she did not know her killer. Random murders are the toughest to solve, but the St. Petersburg police had one powerful piece of evidence that the killer left behind, his DNA profile. But the police needed a suspect to link the DNA to, which could take years or might never happen at all. Sarah Lynn Lewinski. Sometimes it is easy to write off and forget about crime victims like Sarah Lewinski. We tend not to give a second thought when crime happens to criminals, the homeless, or those who live on the other side of town, and when they become victims little is usually said. Sometimes, these people get mentioned in the local press but are often never named. Lewinski's killing probably would have been glossed over in the local Tampa Bay press as well, if it were not for the location of her murder. A murder at the Ronald McDonald House, where family members of children undergoing treatment for serious illnesses stay, surely gave unfavorable attention to St. Petersburg. When she was murdered, Sarah Lewinski had hit rock bottom. Her life had spiraled out of control through a series of bad relationships, drug use, and criminal activity, but things were not always that way. Lewinski was a mother of 4 and had 4 grandchildren, and her family still loved her despite her plethora of demons. "We have wonderful memories of her," said Candace Chessman, one of Lewinski's daughters. And her murderer stole the hope that we all carried in our hearts that we would have the chance to make more memories with her someday. Lewinski had only recently arrived in the Tampa Bay area in an effort to get a fresh start, but with no money or contacts in the area, she quickly turned to her old drug habits and prostitution. Prostitution was an easy and quick way for Lewinski to make money for her drug habit, although it ultimately was the source of her final demise. Much of society may have given up on Sarah Lynn Lewinski, but the St. Petersburg police did not. A DNA match. The homicide detectives of the St. Petersburg Police Department were just as dedicated to catching the killer of Sarah Lynn Lewinski as any other murderer, and they knew that the small bit of DNA they lifted from Lewinski's body would probably be the key to catching him. Chances are someone who would commit such a terrible crime had either done so before or would again at some point in the future. Despite that grim prospect, it meant that there was a good chance of eventually catching Lewinski's killer. The police entered Lewinski's killer's DNA sample into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and waited for a match. The CODIS database was established after the DNA Identification Act became law in 1994. CODIS is an FBI program, but samples are taken from all 50 states, the federal government, and the District of Columbia. At first, samples were taken from convicted sex offenders in various states, but over the years the database has grown to include persons convicted of all felonies, and in some states, those even charged with felonies and some misdemeanors. Each individual state determines its own criteria for who is required to give DNA samples, but by 2006 every state had joined the CODIS database on some level. 2006 also happened to be the year when the DNA from Lewinski's body was matched to a suspect. In many ways, the trajectory of Raymond Samuel's life was similar to Lewinski's. He suffered from a variety of personal issues, was a drug user, and was homeless and only in the Tampa Bay area for a very short time when Lewinski was murdered. But unlike Lewinski, Samuels chose to take out his rage on others. The DNA taken from Lewinski's body was definitively matched to Samuels. It turns out that Samuels was easy to locate. In 2006, he was incarcerated in an Ohio prison with a lengthy sentence for a violent home invasion of an elderly couple. When Samuels entered the Ohio Department of Corrections after his conviction, a sample of his DNA profile was taken and entered into the CODIS database. Detective Mike Kovacev of the St. Petersburg Police Department had not given up on finding Sarah Lewinski's killer and routinely took the time to enter the DNA of the unknown male taken from the victim into the CODIS database. In late 2006, they matched the sample to Samuels, but waited several more years to charge him. There were still too many questions that had to be answered before formal charges could be brought, foremost whether Samuels and Lewinski knew each other. After all, Lewinski was a known prostitute and the DNA sample taken from her body may have been the result of a consensual, paid sexual encounter. Kovacev and other detectives from St. Petersburg traveled to Ohio to interview Samuels, but the convict asserted his Fifth Amendment right and refused to talk. Kovacev was confident that he had his man and kept the Lewinski family continually updated about the case. The family was understanding, said Kovacev. It's not like we had someone out on the street. He was in custody, so he wasn't going anywhere. Forensic technicians ran more tests on the DNA recovered from the scene to make sure they had the right man and, Most importantly, they were also able to match DNA taken from a belt believed to be the murder weapon to Samuels. Samuels was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Lewinski in 2013 and currently sits in the Pinellas County Jail in Florida awaiting trial. Lewinski's family is grateful that Kovacev and the other detectives from St. Petersburg did not forget about their loved one, despite her past. As a family, we are not in denial about where she was in life, but it is important to us that people know that her life was not a waste and not something anyone had the right to take from her, said Candace Chessman. She was not always homeless and alone. Chapter 9. The Murder of Little Anna Palmer.